Some people say that getting a PhD means that you are the world's leading expert in your field. But this is well-meaning nonsense. It's well-meaning because it is meant to give you confidence going into your PhD defense. But it's nonsense because if it were true, it would mean that everybody with a PhD would either be the world's leading expert in a field of one, or that in order to get a PhD, you would have to defeat the current leading expert in some kind of intellectual fight to the death. This might be fun to watch, but it would also mean that almost nobody would get a PhD. And even though the advice is meant to boost your confidence, it can easily have the opposite effect if you know deep down that you're not the world's leading expert in your field, but think that you should be. So there are two questions I would like to address in this video. First, what does it actually mean to get a PhD if not being the world's leading expert? And second, if you did want to become the world's leading expert in your field, or one of the leading experts, how should you go about it? So let's start with what it means to get a PhD. So getting a PhD can have a great deal of personal meaning, which can vary a lot from one student to another. Those meanings are all valid as long as you don't tie up too much of your sense of self-worth in the end result. But if we just think about what it means in terms of the standard you're expected to achieve and what it might indicate to a potential employer, getting a PhD means developing a professional level of competence in academic research. It is the starting point for a potential academic career, not the culmination of your life's work. And you should continue to learn and develop your skills long after you graduate. So as a general rule, if your work is publishable, then it is enough for a PhD. So some university systems require publications, but even when this isn't the case, it's still a good idea to publish if you can, or to at least aim to produce work of a publishable standard. Because if you can produce a few published papers in good peer-reviewed journals, then an examiner would need a very good reason to fail you because your work has already passed peer review. The only reasons why this might happen would be if they uncover really any kind of dishonesty. For example, if it turned out that you hadn't done the work yourself, or that you'd faked or manipulated data, in which case you wouldn't really be able to complain about the result. So getting a few publications is a good idea as it demonstrates this professional level of competence. And getting these first few publications is a big achievement as a PhD student, but it's also the bare minimum for a professional academic. So this brings us to the second, I think, more interesting question. So if you want to become one of the world's leading experts in your field, how should you go about it? So to answer this, I'd like to look at two aspects. So the first is the mindset that you adopt, and then some specific tools in terms of how you approach the work. So in terms of mindset, the first recommendation is to let go of any kind of imposter syndrome. So many PhD students put themselves under so much pressure that they should already be at a certain level. So they tend to hide away for fear of being found out. But all this does is keep you from learning. It keeps you from asking questions and it keeps you from taking any risks. And you'll likely spend years hiding away in the literature and trying to come up with the perfect plan without ever developing the practical skills necessary to execute that plan. Then, of course, when you finally start doing your research, you'll make a load of mistakes, which will then feed back into that sense of not being good enough. And the way to overcome this kind of imposter syndrome is to accept that, of course, you don't know what you're doing, and that you're here to learn and to improve your skills, not to prove how good you already are. And if you're open about what you don't know, then nobody can find you out. You might be worried about what others will think, but most people will like it if you come to work with curiosity and enthusiasm to learn. And this brings us to the next point. If you want to be the best, then you have to learn from others. The whole reason universities exist is to bring together people with different skills and different expertise. So instead of just trying to learn everything from the literature, learn from those around you too. So find out what other people are working on. Read their most recent papers, ask them questions, or at the very least, learn people's names and say hello to them in the corridor. This not only broadens your exposure to different ideas that you never would have found just by reading, it also means that you know who to go to if you need help with a specific aspect of your own research. And they are much more likely to help you if you've shown an interest in their work before you needed something from them. But if people around you react badly to you asking questions, then you should go and work somewhere else. If someone puts you down or reacts angrily or just says, "It's your PhD, I'm not here to help you," then they're giving you valuable information about their attitude and their character. And you should not compromise to appease somebody who isn't interested in helping you. So if your goal is to just get the PhD, then maybe you should just keep your head down and do what you have to get through. But our goal here is to become one of the world's leading experts. And if the environment isn't conducive to that goal, if it isn't serving your needs, then you should change your environment. This is never easy, but if you have high ambitions, then you have to make hard decisions. So it is essential to talk to and learn from others, but you should also be careful about who you seek to emulate. For example, if you see other academics working beyond the point of exhaustion to the point where they look unwell or they're miserable or they can barely keep up with the workload, that's probably not the outcome that you want. But if you see somebody who works hard but somehow seems to not only manage the work but to enjoy the work while also reaching very high standards, it might be worth asking them how they do it. And then it's also important to develop your own ways of working, to look at what others are doing and when necessary, be willing to do the opposite without fear of judgment. For example, one of the things I started doing towards the end of my PhD was to take a walk around the campus whenever I faced a difficult problem in the lab. And this gave me time and space to relax and to think creatively about the problem. And it was one of the habits that actually saved my PhD. But if I'd been worried about appearances, then I would have just stayed in the lab and maybe rushed a response or switched to working on something else for the sake of appearing busy. And this brings us to the final piece on mindset. So if you want to be a world-class researcher, you have to be willing to stay with a problem beyond any initial discomfort. So often we will rush or jump between tasks or procrastinate as a way of avoiding a problem. But these are the moments when you need to be most engaged. And the best researchers, they get excited about an unexpected puzzle. And they are willing to stick with it, to think about it, to obsess over it even, and to keep trying different things until they find a solution. Yes, there are times when you need to put a problem aside and not look at it for a while. And then when you come back to it, the solution might be obvious because the subconscious brain has had time to work on it in the background. But that can only happen if you struggle with it a little bit first, rather than abandoning it at the first sign of stress. So I'll come back to some more specific technical details about skill development in a moment. But before going any further, it's worth asking yourself if you really want to be a world-class researcher and why. So if it's just for the status or legacy or to prove something to people, it's better to quit now. If you need people to respect you for your position, then no amount of success will ever be enough. And you will constantly worry about being outshone by somebody else. And instead of a life driven by curiosity and excitement to learn and to help others learn, you'll end up as one of those superficially successful but deeply insecure academics who is more interested in preserving their own status than research or teaching. And it's better, I think, to do the inner work on the gaps in your own self-esteem than to pursue that kind of hollow academic career where you make yourself and others around you miserable. If you want to do it for the interest in the subject, but you don't enjoy the problem-solving aspect, if you don't enjoy those moments when you don't know what to do and you have to think creatively and try lots of different solutions before something works, then you won't enjoy a life in research. Being an academic is hard enough, and many find it frustrating that they have to deal with all of the admin and the teaching and the grant applications and everything else. But if you also don't enjoy the fundamental research part and the difficult work of problem solving at the edge of knowledge, then why do it? If you don't enjoy the fight, then why step into the ring? But if you do enjoy it, and you're driven by curiosity and the desire to learn and share knowledge, how do you develop your research skills to the very highest level? So the principles I'm about to share are very important because during your PhD, you largely have to manage your own project. And if we assume that you don't already have the skills that you need, then you need to manage your project in a way that helps you to develop those skills. Now, you might have heard the phrase, practice makes perfect, or you might instinctively understand that you need to challenge yourself in order to improve. But there is important nuance to these ideas. Firstly, it's not enough to just challenge yourself. One of the most common mistakes I see among ambitious PhD students is that they set their immediate goals far too high, often in an attempt to prove what they're capable of. And while it's good to have very ambitious long-term goals, if you set your short-term goals far in excess of your current ability, then you won't improve. In fact, you might become less capable as you get overwhelmed by the scale of the task you've taken on. And I made this mistake right at the start of my very first year when my supervisor asked me to write a literature review, and I decided, in an attempt to impress him, that I was going to write the best literature review the world had ever seen. But instead of helping me to get to know the literature, it massively undermined my confidence when I failed to live up to the standard I set myself. So, in order to improve, in the short term, you need to set yourself a challenge that pushes just a little past what you can already do, so that it requires your full effort and attention, but it is achievable within a relatively short time frame. And then, once you've achieved something once, it's then much easier to repeat. So it takes less thought, less effort, less focus, less time. So you can then make the task more and more challenging as your level of skill increases. So instead of spending years reading and writing and planning and then doing one massive round of data collection and then trying to figure out how to use analytical software on a huge data set, you can practice all of these things on a really small scale in the space of a few days or weeks, starting with the simplest possible version and then gradually scaling up. Now, this also gives you the opportunity to make mistakes, which will then be much easier to find, fix, and learn from if you're only adding a little bit of complexity each time than if you're trying to do it all in one go on the most ambitious scale. So it is okay to think big. It's good to think big, but you have to start small and let yourself make mistakes as you gradually scale up. Now, this alone can make an enormous difference to your PhD, but again, there is some nuance. So, if we constantly push at the limits of what we can do, then we might improve quite quickly at first. But eventually, inevitably, even if we're only trying to up the difficulty a little bit, we'll hit some kind of block where we just stop improving. And it doesn't matter how much we practice or how hard we work, we just don't seem to be getting any better. And when this happens, you might think that you've hit the limits of your innate talent, but this is unlikely. So, with most tasks, you don't need to do them perfectly. There's a certain margin of error where you can do things far less than perfectly, but still succeed. If you then repeat that task again and again, it will probably seem like you're getting better, as the repetition helps to establish and then reinforce neural pathways in the brain. So you can perform the same task faster and with much less conscious thought. And while this is very useful, and it's a crucial part of skill development, it can also ingrain bad habits, which then get harder to break the more you repeat them. And then to make it more difficult, when you try to do things quickly or when you're under stress, then the brain relies more heavily on these established patterns. So if the way that you're trying to do something isn't working, it is much, much harder to adapt. So in these situations, the only option is to slow down and work carefully and deliberately, thinking about what you're doing instead of relying on instincts. And the ability to do this, to slow down and think calmly and clearly when you're under pressure, is one of the traits of the very best researchers. But we don't want to wait until we're under this kind of pressure to develop this ability. And this next tip is one that makes the difference between people who are just very good at what they do and the very, very best. So the very best in any field are not the best because of the flashy, advanced things they can do. They tend to be the best because of mastery of the fundamentals. So, while they absolutely push themselves and take on steadily greater challenges and take risks, they don't stay at the limits of their ability all the time, or even most of the time. Instead, no matter how experienced, they keep going back to the basics, trying to perfect the tiniest details, trying to find more efficient ways, or even just different ways of doing things that they already know how to do. In other words, they maintain a beginner's mindset with the curiosity and the humility to go back to basics again and again and again. And this is often where the major breakthroughs happen, when somebody re-examines what was previously taken for granted, but it's also crucial for continual skill development. So when I was an undergraduate physics student, in the first year, everybody had to take foundational mathematics modules. So this made sense, as mathematics is the language of physics, but the pass mark was only 40%. And this meant that you could scrape through knowing less than half of the material. But even somebody who did exceptionally well, scoring say 90%, still wouldn't know 10% of the syllabus. They would be fine going into the next module and the next and the next, but eventually that slightly weak foundation, if not fixed, would start to crack. And if I had known then what I know now, then I would have kept taking that exam or past papers until I could reliably score 100% every single time, because it would have made the rest of the degree and my PhD and my postdoc career after that so much easier. Now, I wouldn't have become the world's leading physicist. In part because for certain skills, like chess or mathematics or theoretical physics, you need to start young to reach the very highest level. And when you get to the very top, when we're talking about the undisputed best in the world, innate talent is a factor. But the limit of your talent probably isn't where you think it is. And while you probably won't become the world's leading expert in your field, you can use these kind of principles to get very, very good at what you do and to have a meaningful, fulfilling, and enjoyable career. Now, in part 2, I will talk about how to build your network and your reputation and some of the things you might want to consider if you want to build a world-class research career. And if you want to know when that video is available, then head to my website at phd.academy and join the email list so I can let you know directly when I publish new videos. And in the meantime, if you have any questions about anything in this video, please just leave a comment below. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.